Hi there and welcome to the video. I'm your host John Ivison. Last week the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion was formally completed, doubling the capacity of a pipeline that had pre-existed between Edmonton and Vancouver, the lower mainland of BC. It was built in 1953. In doing so, it overcame a host of legal, social, political hurdles, not to mention the physical challenge of building through some of the most difficult terrain in the country. Today I'm joined by Ian Anderson, who was the President and Chief Executive of Trans Mountain Corporation until he retired in 2022. Hi Ian, thanks for coming on.
Hello John, thanks for having me.
So just to start off with, perhaps you could give us a potted history of your own professional career and your involvement with Trans Mountain.
Yeah, sure. My career started really in Winnipeg. I'm a certified management accountant. Don't hold that against me, but I started a career in the utility business, the natural gas business, distribution in Winnipeg. Went through, I think in my career, John, about 7 different ownership changes from Northern and Central, which was an old Conrad Black company, to ICG, to Centra Gas, to West Coast Energy, BC Gas, made my way from Winnipeg to Victoria to Vancouver. And I came to Calgary in 2005 to work at Trans Mountain, which was then called Terrace Pipelines. We had several pipelines. And came here for a 2-year stint to help out the Terrace team, and I never left. Terrace was acquired by Kinder Morgan in 2005. At that time, Rich Kinder asked me to oversee the pipeline operations here in Canada that he'd acquired from Terrace. I agreed to that, and we really started work on the expansion of the Trans Mountain system in 2007 and 8 when we built the first, twinning of the part through Jasper and Mount Robson Parks. And then we started to undertake the major expansion that, as you said, was just completed last week. So we started this expansion project in really conceptually by design in 2010.
Right. So we'll go back through the history, but the completion, it seems to me, is a great achievement, something that should be celebrated by Canadians. I got a little bit carried away last week in a column when I compared TMX to the building of the country's first transcontinental railway, immortalised in Pierre Berton's classic, The Last Spike. I accept it's not that magnitude, but it is a nation-building project. What do you think its legacy is going to be?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, it is certainly, by tripling its size, it's providing global market access for our very, precious oil and gas reserves like we've never had before. So for the first time, we're actually going to be a global player in the sale of those commodities, and that will make a huge difference to the basin here in Alberta and Saskatchewan and British Columbia, for that matter, in terms of egress and access to market, which will equate to better prices, which will equate to more royalties, more taxes, more jobs, and hopefully a more favorable investment climate. The legacy, though, is, if I had to pick a couple of things real quickly, John, one of them would be what I believe to be the best-in-class work we did with Indigenous communities. We invested a lot of time. I personally invested a ton of my time. At one point, I think I estimated about 40% of my time during the period of maybe 2013 to 2020 was spent working with Indigenous communities to provide opportunity, to provide economic advantage. So we did a tremendous amount of work there. And I hope that left lessons for others. The other legacy, I think, that is maybe a bit less positive is surely we as a nation can look at the Trans Mountain journey from 2010 to 2024 and learn something, and learn why did it take that long? What were the obstacles that prevented a much more expeditious completion of the project? You mentioned the original Trans Mountain. It was built in 24 months, just over 2 to 3 years. We took, all told, probably 14, from beginning to end. And something is broken if infrastructure projects take that long to build. and required public investment. Private capital was not going to build this project.
Well, let's work our way through that, because that's obviously a long and complicated process. One of the things that after I wrote the piece last week, I got a lot of pushback to the idea that this was an achievement, and a number of readers took issue with that characterization. One person saying it was a total embarrassment to Canada, another pointing out that the original budget was $5.4 billion when Kinder Morgan sold it. I'm not sure if that's the case. And yet taxpayers shelled out 7 times that amount. We can get into the issue of the sale as we go through this, but is that fair that that it was an embarrassment, and would it have been cheaper and quicker if a private company had built it?
This project was going to cost what it cost, regardless of owner. The federal government and their ownership of Trans Mountain had no effect on what the ultimate price of the project was. The only effect they would have had, which I believe to be a positive one, would be they encouraged me to design and build the best pipeline we could, respecting the land, respecting the traditional territories, respecting the environment, with a broad workforce of Canadians, both union and non-union, with lots of local contractors and local support. So I was encouraged to build a project for the country that the country could be proud of, and we've done that. So I don't think it's an embarrassment at all. When we started this project, the topics of in the media, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, energy transition, Indigenous reconciliation were not topics that were talked about on the front page in 2010, 2011, we started this. And being able to allow for contingencies for everything we faced. Social media had a huge effect on how people viewed the project and how they shared information. The political wills around local interests in communities had a great bearing on the pace at which we could execute. So there's no way we could have ever allowed for those kinds of things in the original estimation of the project. And, it cost what it cost through all the hard work and discipline and choices we made, but we built the best pipeline in the world.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of this project and the physical challenges that were involved? When you mentioned the workforce, I gather it was somewhere around 26,000 people were involved in the construction over the course of it, and a good proportion of them were Indigenous and women and all sorts of people, right?
I think at the peak we had 15,000 people working in total. I think the total is somewhere between 25,000, 30,000 individuals worked on the project. 10% of those people were Indigenous. So that's thousands of Indigenous people worked on this project and took those paychecks back into their communities and into their homes to benefit their lives. It's 1,000 kilometers of pipe and everything from prairie landscape in Alberta through the Coquihalla, the terrain, and then going through the Fraser Valley into Vancouver in a large urban center. When the original pipe was put in, Vancouver had a population of a few 100,000. Well, it's several million now. And so following the corridor, we followed the existing right of way about 75% of the way, meant that we had to build in people's backyards and through parks and through, I think, half a dozen golf courses. So the terrain was challenging from day one. We knew that it was going to be, and credit to the engineers for, we tunneled through Burnaby Mountain from our terminal down to the dock, and that was never in the original plan. But at the request of really the local community in Burnaby, we took the pipe out of their community and out of their roadways and burrowed it through a tunnel that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but in the end is safer, more sustainable, and a more responsible project.
So protesters initially threatened to make this a repeat of Standing Rock in North Dakota, where armed soldiers and police in riot gear dispelled the protest.
Yeah.
In the event, the protests were pretty muted from my perspective. I may be wrong, but there weren't so many high-profile events and not that many arrests from what I gather, right?
There were a handful of arrests in and around Kamloops, and the protest activity really was a bit of a roller coaster. There were spikes in protest activity in and around Kamloops when we were going underneath the North Thompson River. There was an encampment up in Blue River, up in the North Thompson, that was there during the whole time of expansion, and it caused some conflict and but nothing that affected our progress, and it was far away from kind of media centers, if you like. In 2010-11, we had on Burnaby Mountain a good degree of protest activity. The thing, so there were pockets of it, John, but I wouldn't say there was anything sustained in location that prevented us from proceeding. And one of the mantras I took up early on was I wanted to learn from those protests, which sounds a bit odd, but I wanted to understand who it was that was protesting over what, because there's no single face of protest. Everybody's there for somewhat different reasons. There's the more extreme anarchists, that are there just to protest, and there are others who are, mothers with baby carriages just curious about what's going on. So I sought to understand that a little bit more deeply. I met with the heads of many of the environmental groups that were participating in those protests to understand better what they wanted, what we could do differently. So I think that effort helped improve the project, but it also perhaps muted some of the activity.
Right, and we spoke previously, and you said that you got 60 Indigenous communities on board. That doesn't happen without a great deal of effort, and it was Stuart Muir told me the story that he sat down with a local chief who you'd met with, and the chief said, "Are you going to keep this stuff in the pipe?" And you said, "Yes, we are," and that was enough for him. We shook hands, and he was on board. So that must speak to your credibility to some extent.
Well, I suppose it does, but it also speaks to the efforts that we took as a team to get to understand those communities. Like I said early on, I knew how to do business in Burnaby and Merritt and Kamloops and Edson and Edmonton. I didn't have any clue how to do business in Simcoe or Lower Nicola or Upper Nicola or Stolo Nation. So I had to understand personally what our project meant to them, what that intersection caused, what impact we were having, and then chart a course forward. And when I left, we had 63 support agreements from nations along the corridor. Every single nation from Edmonton to Burnaby supported us, and then a number on Vancouver Island on the Marine Corridor. So it was a great achievement. Took a lot of work, and hopefully it, as I said earlier, paints a bit of a roadmap for others.
Just looking at the politics of it now, the Liberal government seemed to have decided quite early on, in 2015, 2016, that they were going to wave through TMX and say no to all the other pipelines, Northern Gateway, Keystone. Was this something of a blessing and a curse? I mean, you got the government's blessing, but it meant that you were the lightning rod for all criticism and protest.
I think that the fact that we had an existing line in the ground, the fact that we're going from an existing terminal in Edmonton to an existing terminal in Burnaby, always gave us a bit of advantage in that we were more brownfield than greenfield, if you like. I think then the demonstrated work we did in communities to gain momentum and support and showed how we were going to respect the land and territories, I think all helped us at the end of the day. And each one of those projects were different. Northern Gateway was going to a different location, difficult terrain, greenfield. Keystone XL faced all of the, U.S. politics coming and going with them. And we stayed the course. And I never lost confidence that we were going to succeed, John. I mean, we went through a lot of different premiers and prime ministers and mayors and chiefs over a decade, but never lost confidence that we weren't doing it the right way and that we wouldn't succeed. But it was a political football for quite a while. I mean, I can remember the Alison Redford days and the Christy Clark days and the Rachel Notley days, and those weren't easy days. The John Horgan days.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because am I right in saying that the feds had given the project their approval, And the real problems began when the NDP-Green coalition was elected under John Horgan in BC, promising to do everything they could to scuttle the project. Do you think Kinder Morgan would have proceeded with the project if that hadn't happened?
That's a great question, and one that we'll never know the answer to. But what I would say is that Kinder Morgan and their board were increasingly concerned about my ability to finish this project. They could see me getting started, as we did get started under Kinder Morgan ownership. But seeing the finish line was something that was just far too opaque for them and far too uncertain, whether that's because we were still before the Supreme Court challenged by BC in cold water, whether it was because BC was going to attempt to frustrate us wherever they could, or Derek Corrigan, the mayor of Burnaby, was going to frustrate us at every turn. There were a number of things, I think, that led Kinder Morgan to conclude that that was not an investment they were prepared to pursue. Certainly, the John Horgan days, and don't get me wrong, John Horgan was a good friend of mine, but he had his politics and he had his party that he had to.
We had a coalition with the Greens, right? Which he had to live up.
And as he would describe to me, when he looked left, he looked a long way left before he saw his last caucus member. So he had a large, if you like, suite of members to satisfy. The Christy Clark government wasn't easy either. We had our 5 conditions we had to satisfy with her, and we did. So we just persevered and stayed resilient and made it through. But it wasn't for the faint of heart.
Do you think it was a bad decision for taxpayers for the government to buy the pipeline?
Not at all.
Do you think they'll get their money back, and will it be good for the Canadian economy?
It will certainly be good for the Canadian economy. I think we'll see the differentials start to shrink almost immediately. They have a bit already. How quickly they shrink and how much that contributes to the value of the Canadian barrel will be seen.
Just to explain to readers, to viewers, that is the differential between what Canadian companies get for their oil and the West Texas price, right?
Correct. And it over the years, it's peaked at $20, $30, $35. I think it's in the high teens right now, and I expect that to come down a little bit. So I think that will be an immediate benefit to Canada, because that means higher royalties, higher taxes, higher, investment opportunity. What listeners need to realize is that cost of the pipeline will be sitting on Trans Mountain's books. Like, it will be Trans Mountain corporate equity and debt. It's not on the balance sheet of the federal government. The federal government helped us raise the money to build it, certainly, and their credit rating helped that. But that money sits on the books of Trans Mountain. Right. The cash flow from Trans Mountain, just in relative terms, before and after expansion, goes from something around $200 million a year up to close to $2 billion a year. So it generates a lot of cash very, very quickly. And that's cash that will be down there to pay the interest costs and to pay down the debt. And the economic impact is estimated to be $7 billion a year of uplift to the Canadian economy. So, at whatever cost, I think that the cost will be a footnote at the end of the day to really the value of this pipe to Canada and what it will prove to be over the decades to come.
Just talk me through the final drama, because after you'd sailed through all of this, the Federal Court of Appeal came out and overturned all the project's permits. Were you kind of tearing your hair out thinking this project is cursed at this point?
Yeah, that was quite a day, John. It was August 30th and 31st of 2018 when the shareholders of Kinder Morgan approved the sale to the federal government, and the next day we lost our permit. And I had all parties of the federal government coming into my office 3 days later to celebrate and plan our way forward. That became a little bit different agenda, and we undertook hard work immediately to get that permit back. And we lifted our heads and we picked up our bootstraps and we got to work. And the federal government committed, great resources under Justice Iacobucci's leadership to redo consultation with nations that they were deemed to have not done adequately. and we got to work on looking at some of the marine conditions around the southern resident killer whale population to understand the impacts on them. And within a year, we had our permit back. We were back working. But it was a kind of a surreal day that we were sold and lost our approval to proceed on the same day.
Yeah. Just finally, there aren't many other big oil projects in the pipeline, pun intended, after TMX. Prices are recovering. Do you think that Canada is missing out on an opportunity to take advantage of its resources?
Well, I will always think that Canada has the resources that the world wants and needs. Canada is arguably the best place in the world to be developing these resources responsibly, both from the environment and socially. Our regulations and our expectations of communities and customers all lead me to conclude that we're the best place in the world to be developing the resources that the world needs. And my objective would be that the last barrel sold is a Canadian barrel. I think that we're going to be producing some of the best oil in the world, the most responsible oil, and that requires access. And, I often get asked, is this the last pipeline to be built? And, that's where the question goes. And I don't necessarily think so, because if two things can happen, if we can learn from the experience of Trans Mountain and others, and Keystone and Northern Gateway, about what those obstacles are, if we learn from that and understand how to be more efficient and respect private capital has its tolerances that need to be managed. If we can learn, then it becomes a matter of buyer and seller. And if you got commercial counterparties who are prepared to invest in the production and acquire, the commodity, that's what stimulates a project. It has to be commercial first. Then you go through the process of determining whether you can build it in a responsible, cost-effective way. So I don't think that this is necessarily the last one. I think it will take a shift in perhaps some of the political perspectives in Canada, that it's okay to develop this resource responsibly for the world. The world will have its limitations on how much oil it ultimately consumes, but it's going to consume it. And my preference always would be that the Canadian barrel is the last one consumed.
It does bring to mind a letter that you wrote, I guess the floods in BC in 2021.
Yep.
And perspectives in BC seemed to shift at that point, when it was realised that you might run out of oil because the pipeline was shut down for a good number of days, right?
The pipeline was shut down for well over a week, a couple of weeks actually. And the common understanding at that point was that the Lower Mainland would run out of gasoline if Trans Mountain was shut down for more than 5 days. So what we did is we worked with alternative suppliers out of Washington State, bringing up gasoline and diesel by barge into Vancouver and onto Vancouver Island. We worked to build up as much supply as we could in some of our storage facilities. But yeah, it was a day-to-day nail biter of whether or not Vancouver was going to run out of gasoline. And I think a lot of lights went on, if so to speak, when they realized how critical this infrastructure was, not just to the global trade of oil, but to their day-to-day lives. And right. Are we going to hopefully consume less fossil fuels as we age? I hope so. I hope we make that transition, but it's going to take decades to get there. In the meantime, let's be proud of the riches that we have.
I guess a world without oil would concentrate the minds. So, Ian, thank you very much for your time. Congratulations on a job well done.
Most welcome, John, and thanks for the interest. Take care.